Welcome to the Books Applied podcast, presented by WSL Leadership. In this podcast, we talk about an awesome book and how to apply it to your work, sport, or life. I'm your host, Iggy Perillo. Thanks for joining me. On today's episode, we're talking about the book Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. And joining me today is Charley Downing. I'm very excited to talk with you about this book, Charley. Can you introduce yourself a little bit for the audience?
Of course. Thank you. Yeah, my name is Charley Downing. I use she, her pronouns. I live here in Portland. I'm currently working with and How I Met Iggy through Northwest Outward Bound School. I'm the first director of equity, inclusion, and diversity, which is also a little bit how I came to find and connect with this book. Prior to that, I was working as a director for a residential program serving adolescents with addiction and mental health issues. And then prior to that, working in reproductive health, which of course has a slice of equity and inclusion and disparate impacts for communities. So for many years, been at least adjacent to equity and inclusion and the isms issues. So
Right. And I guess I didn't totally say it, but the full title of this book is Caste, The Origin of Our Discontents, which I think is interesting and fascinating, right? The subtitle there. I'm wondering how you came across this book, Charley. I feel like a few years ago, it was like everywhere. Like had huge amount of popularity and press and everything. I wonder, how did you find it, or how did it find you?
Yeah, I missed that. I think I had my head down working in residential care, and that's about all I did. It's pretty high, stakes environment, and didn't have much of a social life. I actually found it later through On Being. Actually, Krista Tippett does an interview with her, and I think they're in front of an audience, if I remember right. And I was so hooked. So they go through in the book, she talks about a lot of different metaphors for race in the United States. And that's how they organized the podcast or the interview that they were doing. And at the time, I was working on building training modules for staff at NWABS. And I was really struggling with the question of how to design the training that would be, there are a lot of different things, but I think really safe for folks in the non-dominant caste as well. My experience of a lot of training has been, this is for anti-bias training, and we're mostly talking to you white folks in the room, and I'm supposed to just sort of sit and stand by and kind of have my own experience by myself. So I really wanted to do something a little bit different. And I wanted to really think, I knew there was a different way to think about race that was a bit bigger and almost even safer for individuals to conceptualize. And I just thought she was doing such a beautiful job of taking this very complicated topic and sort of simplifying it in a way and building this scaffold for us to think about and situate our, like you said, what did you just say, the root of our discontent?
The origins
where we're
of our
at right now, the origins, what is at the core there? What's the scaffold that we keep building on top of that we can't see? But if we really look carefully, we could see the actual scaffold itself is rooted in this idea of caste. It blew my mind. I loved it.
Yeah, that's so great. I think it's interesting. Like you mentioned, I definitely have sat in on my share of equity and diversity trainings, as through many different types of organizations. And I've been in very white-dominated organizations, and so that's who you're talking to, right? The white people. Here's what we're going to talk about. And it's about race, blah, blah, blah. And every once in a while there's gender things or sexual identity things kind of added on. But often that was the sort of dominant topic of the equity or inclusion training kind of things, which is weird in a space that is very dominated by white people to talk about inclusion. And you're like, okay, look around. Who are we including here? A little bit weird sometimes. And I think the idea that being attentive to the experience of the people who are the non-dominant group. And I think she does this throughout the book. She she's talking about race. She's like, there's this overlap between race and caste, but they're not exactly completely the same thing all the time. And I think it's an interesting distinction that she makes. And so race, or the visual presentation of race, is a signal of caste, she would say. And that's how we decide what we do, or how we make assumptions often is based on the sort of visual input that we get from folks. But the reality is a lived experience that has been, there's like a lot of history to this lived experience. And I like her metaphors. You mentioned this too. Are there some favorite metaphors of hers that caught your attention as you've gone through this book or this? Yeah.
Yeah. I used a few in particular in staff trainings. I really loved, let me start with that one. That was my favorite. She talks about the old house.
Yes, I love the old house.
Right?
Yeah.
When you buy an old house, and we all know, I think she says, we know when we buy an old house, there's going to be something that needs repair. And as soon as you fix it, there's going to be something else. And maybe you get a report. The person comes in and does the evaluation and gives you the report of all the things that need to be fixed, and you need to triage that. And she says, when we get that report, we could not read it, and that doesn't help us, right? or we could feel really guilty and weighted about it, and be sort of kind of pity ourselves that it wasn't our fault, right? We could get lost in that, or we could just read the report and just start addressing these issues. And that's how the metaphor is, like how we respond to what we learn about our problems around race or gender, for that matter. We have those options. But the idea is get the report, read the report, don't take it personally. It wasn't your fault.
Yeah.
But the scaffold is still there.
Yeah.
So the idea is and then beyond that, any of the repairs that we don't do, the damage that continues to happen then going forward does fall onto us. It is in our hands, right? So I really liked that as one of her metaphors.
Well, yeah, she's like, just because you weren't here when the house was built doesn't mean you get to ignore the problems it has now.
The foundation is still faulty.
Yeah, the pipes are still leaking. It's still a situation that is happening right now.
And you are harmed too by not addressing it. I think that was the other piece too. I don't know if she actually ever says that, but it occurred to me, I'm living in the house. So my not attending to this culture, this phenomenon, doesn't serve me either, even if I'm in a dominant caste, right?
Right.
That leaky roof damages my life, has an immediate impact on me too. So that piece of we all suffer in different ways, but it was making me think today as I was getting ready to chat with you, because I was thinking, how am I this book is so complicated and deep.
Oh yeah.
How can I do a good service? What do I even focus on? But I was thinking about how hard it is for, I think, folks in the holding dominant identities to think about what was sacrificed, what was lost in that exchange. Because the other metaphor she talks about is caste, C-A-S-T. The moment we're born, we're cast into a role, whether that's gender and race, and we're expected to fulfill the obligations of that role. If your assigned role is that you're of the dominant caste and you can take advantage of people's labor and you can make all of the decisions, what's the trade-off there? What maybe not acknowledge that we don't have the opportunity, I think, to acknowledge that puts us all into a box and inhibits us all from being able to actually live out the magical beings we could be, because we're subscribing to these roles based on this invisible structure, these invisible pillars, or I think she talks about them as pillars. I think that's how she organized the book into different pillars that are invisible to us unless we peel those walls back.
Right, but the structures are still pervasive. They might be invisible, but they are everywhere.
In everything.
Constantly. And so her previous work was about folks leaving, people of color leaving the South to escape Jim Crow laws. And I'm not as familiar with that, but I've read a little bit about the book. I haven't read the book itself. And she's really good at telling these stories that are very humanizing, about very specific people. I know for that book, she tracks a family pretty much. And they are some key players that she comes back to over and over again. And I think in this book, she does a really good job of bringing in all these different pictures of what this looks like and how it looks. And then she whips out this big comparison to when previous to reading this book, when I heard the word caste, I thought of India, right? Like that is sort of the global historical caste system that many of us have been introduced to, like really probably through school social studies classes, to be honest. Like nothing, I don't have a depth of like exploration there, but it's like, oh, there's a caste system.
Learning about Gandhi.
Yeah, exactly. And colonialism is thrown in there maybe a tiny bit, but like really people are born either into this type of family or this type of family. They're born with this label, or they're, and there are many, I think, in there more than I'm obviously super aware of, but this comes up with like the Untouchables was like the name, which got reorganized and into the Dalit, which means the broken people, which is really fascinating, right? Because this idea of like, well, they're not untouchable because of how they happen to be born or who their parents happen to be. They're broken by a system or by the like idea of how people treat them and act toward folks, literally based on who they are and how they've been, And I think she talks through the story of going to a conference and people were speaking or whatever, and she saw there were folks from India at this conference. I'm pretty sure she tells the story. And then a fellow was talking, blah, 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 delivering his research, kind of a research social science conference. And some other folks from India were sort of talking to him and quizzing him, and realized she sort of was watching this conversation happen. And she's like, oh, they're trying to figure out who his family is so they can understand what his caste is so they know how to treat him right now. Even in this like very like academic conference, sort of setting, she was like, oh, this is actually what's happening right now, that I'm watching these people try to sort out the caste of the people involved, even though that wasn't what it was about. That wasn't the point, that wasn't the purpose, but it is such a habit. And I think without this sort of very visual cue of race, could you imagine? I could imagine this exact same thing happening, being like, oh, who are your parents? Oh, where are you from? Oh, blah, 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 blah. Like I think I could imagine just a mirror image.
Sort it out. Yeah. Right.
The very same thing happening in like a US, based population. So we have the caste system of India, but then I think interesting and unexpected to me was her exploration and research into the caste system created by the Nazi Germany, like the Reich regime, Third Reich.
I really appreciated that.
Yeah, and I was like, I hadn't thought of that. I mean, obviously, yes, looking back on it, you're like, well, duh, that's what the point was. But to sort of compare these three, like the U.S. and sort of race relations, India and this very thousands of years of established caste based on family sort of heritage, and then and then Germany under the Nazi regime, where it was race / family / like visual, like all these different pieces made up the sort of caste divisions there, which was interesting. I don't know if you have any thoughts on these sort of three different system comparison.
Because there were different outcomes that played out a little differently. There was some information sharing, and we know Hitler's, a lot of his, I forget the names for them, but he had people researching laws on the United States on the ways that the United States exterminated or attempted to exterminate our indigenous communities and peoples, as well as our laws against our black and brown, really, actually, and how we created whiteness.
Right.
That was really heavily researched by Hitler and his men. But the commonality is this human desire for hierarchy.
Yeah, right.
That's why I love this idea of talking about caste, because it allows us to look at this. What is this about human nature that we really want to have a dominant culture or dominant people and subordinate people? If we aren't able to really look at that, it will just continue to growth. It will evolve, right?
Right.
And it does. It evolves, but we still have the hierarchy where someone has to be on the bottom. I think a lot of different great thinkers have thought about like someone has to be that bottom role in all of these different cultures, and how that our economy is built off of that. And if we can't let that go, then we'll keep perpetuating the same harms. And then,
Absolutely.
like I said, people won't be able to fulfill their highest like capabilities if we don't really look at that.
For sure. One of the things about the Nazi researchers, they looked at the American laws around
Yeah.
marriage and who
Yep.
could marry who, which was
Yes.
very, very racially divided. And they read these laws from different places because, as we know, historically, states could make their own laws around who could marry who,
Mm-hmm.
and it was very racially divided. And they didn't believe it. They were like, "This can't be
That's
real.
Too far. Too much.
Yeah, that's ridiculous. Like, how could you even say that?" And you're like, "Oh, okay."
But we're so smart, right? Because the reason there's two things. There's the access. Who gets access to whom? Right? For, I guess, sex. If I could say that. It was like, because that is different from who can have a relationship with whom. Right? White men can have access to everybody. But if there was a relationship, if there was actual marriage,
a contract, right?
We got to draw the line there, because we don't want you as a member of the dominant group to have a vested interest or care for members of the subordinate group or the non-favored,
or to share power with. Fundamentally,
absolutely, no, we can't have that. So yeah,
fascinating. And I was like, oh wow,
right,
cool. Well, that
makes sense. We're so smart. That's awful.
yeah, exactly. I'm curious how you see the book or the ideas in this book informing the work that you do currently. Or how do you see it playing out? Or are there influences that come to mind? I know like one of your huge roles is training, but also I think you work within the side of policy and like analysis of operations. I think is sort of all your purview. So I'm curious if there's any of those ways you see it present.
I think it's still evolving. I may want to come back to that question in a year once I really right, because in my first, I've only been with Outward Bound about a year and a half or something like that, and really did focus a lot on the trainings with this book and use that to inform my training and I'm beginning to start to develop a strategic plan or to operationalize that. And so I found that the concepts in this book and a few others, I was reading My Grandmother's Hands at the same time. That as I was reading Caste, and I followed that up pretty quickly with this book called Caliban and the Witch.
I'm not familiar with that one.
Super fascinating. She's focusing on the time period from feudalism to the money economy.
Oh, okay.
And how gender roles shifted. So a different layer of caste. And so all of those concepts around healing, what it all boils down to me is healing.
Right.
How do we organize policies, procedures to account for human beings coming together, harming each other, and healing? Like, that has been a really curious space for me. So it's informed the creation of what we have as a beloved crew, instead of sort of a really behind the desk EID committee that's focused on data and demographics. And we've focused on how do you create a community that engages in healing and being able to have learning moments and call them out. So we've really based ourselves around emergent strategies. If you know her work.
Yeah. I was reading that. I'm reading that's some Adrienne Marie Brown.
Yes.
I'm reading Holding Change like right now, which is so good. Super fascinating. I have not read Emergent Strategies yet, but I know this, Holding Change is sort of the book after that. So she references it a little bit.
Right. So I feel like, I'm sorry, I'm answering your question in such a jumbled way.
That's all right.
It's very much processing it at the same time.
I love it.
I'm like holding this, like, it's almost, how there's that conversation in comedy around who gets to poke fun at who, and this idea of punching up, right? In that same way, it's like so simplified, like, hey, it's actually just really easy.
Yeah.
I kind of think about that with some of the concepts from her book too, is that, oh, hey, these systems operate in so many ways in the nonprofit sector, in capitalist economies. How do we help folks who hold power within organizations recognize that they're holding power and not just use, like, one step would be using that power benevolently, but another would be, how do we think about the organizational structure so that we're really elevating the voices of the people that are most impacted, whether that's surveys or listening circles or thinking about this. I've developed this training around equity, inclusion, and diversity that definitely harvests quite a lot of material from Isabel Wilkerson's work, as well as Resmaa Menachen's book, and others, and thinking, oh, what if we were to do this work in little pods of people within the group? So we're actually engaging in the material over time rather than just have one EID training this year.
We did our hour. We're done.
Done. Exactly. No, but if we want to engage in systems change, then you have to bring folks together from different layers of the organization and actually wrestle with some of these concepts over time.
Right.
I think. So I very much a work in progress.
Right. Well, that's great.
That front.
What, you haven't solved it yet? Come on.
Oh, dang it. It's so complicated.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that being so, like, basically it sounds like you're really looking at it in terms of the humans, but also the humans in the present and the past, and at all these different levels throughout the organization at the same time, which is great. I mean, it's a fairly big organization. There's a lot of people involved. There's tons of moving parts.
So many people.
Recently, I've been doing more work around helping organizations change how they respond to conflict, which adjacent to conflict is how they respond, what the organizational discipline policy is. And I would say I've read the NWOB's discipline policy. It is very traditional. It is a classic, you can see my little air quotes if you want to, progressive discipline policy, which just means it's step by step by step. And it isn't, and the shift from progressive discipline policy, which is the classic verbal warning, written warning, some coaching maybe, and then you get fired. Like that's like literally
You're
like the
track.
policy is
PFD,
3 sentences. But the other option is to have a more like restorative policy, which is healing oriented, right? Which is a lot of different work. And it is difficult to shift the mindset from the sort of progressive discipline is very punishment oriented. Like, well, you get the written write up, I'm like, so you get a hand slap? Like, what? It goes in my permanent record? Like, what does this even mean? But it is a shame/punishment oriented discipline policy that is alive and well in, I would say, 99.9% of the organizations I've ever been involved with that I haven't helped change to something else. And then to be like, well, how do we respond to this differently? Like, let's question what we mean by discipline and who needs to be disciplined and who does the disciplining. But also this idea of discipline means behavior that we don't want somehow. And there's some pretty blatant examples of behavior we don't want in an organization, but there are a lot more examples of people being stressed or in conflict or in not right relationship within organizations that is just sort of swept under the rug. Like, well, it's not a discipline issue. It's not no one broke a policy. And I know, and I know that the world of Outward Bound has a lot of policies and you follow them. And there's many safety related ones that you're like, yes, we will wear helmets when we climb. Like obviously some are very cut and dried, but there are sort of other murkier, interesting policies or expectations that are not really addressed through a discipline policy. Let alone a discipline policy that's based on shame and punishment versus one that's based on restoration and repair. So I think that's how I see sort of Caste playing out at an organizational level. Like, oh, we have a policy. If you Google like organizational discipline policy, you get something from on the internet, which you'll find everywhere, which is the lawyers have vetted it. It says this, it says blah, 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 and you're done. You just slap that into your organization and go on with your day. But it's like this fundamental layer of like, do we ever question that? Do we ever question like what happens when people are out of line or, whatever it is in terms of how that perpetuates power dynamics or how that perpetuates caste or how that perpetuates systems that we're already in. And once you start to like pick at those systems a little bit, you can tell whose feathers get ruffled really quickly, but you can also like basically explore like this kind of faulty, not so stable foundation to things. We're like, why do we do it that way? Why do we give someone a verbal warning than a written warning? Like, what is that? What is that about? Like,
it's always been it that way.
Yeah, it's so weird. Like, that's just how you do it, right? Versus like, let's engage with people and engage with them at the level of needs and at the level of repair. But to engage with needs and repair, suddenly it's a very different conversation than me showing up being like, you've been late 3 times. Here's your write up. It's different. And I'm not going to say it's harder. It's just very different from the sort of
No,
the system we are used to. Most of us are used to in most places.
yeah. Wow, that's a great. I love that idea of looking at the discipline policy, and you bring up a good point about all of the things that aren't included, all of the behaviors that you said were murky.
Yeah.
When you said that, I thought of, oh, and those are the things that folks within a hierarchy. I guess what I'm trying to say is that's where I feel like already marginalized folks from non-dominant groups or our onlys are really at risk.
Oh yeah, or forgotten, right, or just pushed out. Absolutely.
Yeah.
If you're not on board with this system, which is designed not for you, then
which is not designed for you, by the way.
Yeah.
Right. And that really is such a loss of opportunity to engage in harm and repair. It means we get to solve problems in a different way and maybe shift organizational culture around people.
Right. And like to work at the level of culture versus at the level of like policy is a reflection of culture, is a reflection of policy. Like obviously procedure reflects culture, reflects procedure, like there's sort of these things very intermingled in terms of like, well, we just changed the policy, that'll change the culture. Like, no. Or we change the culture and that'll change the procedure. I'm like, maybe, but if it's all codified and you like have a checklist you have to follow every time, like that's going to be tough. And so I think there's like a co-evolution of both, policy / procedure, but also culture at the same time. And I think I think issues of caste are difficult to separate or to identify within cultures, like established cultures for sure, where people have been around and around and around. Like what am I swimming? Am I a fish in a tank? Is this water? What even is this? Like it's really ingrained and embedded into operations within organizations. And I mean, Isabel Wilkerson would say within humans, within American society, like we just have absorbed this and internalized it so much that we live it and propagate it subconsciously all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just presumed. It's arbitrary. It's presumed to be true. You get the role at birth, and why question it?
Yeah, and good luck. See ya.
And when you don't play out your role, everybody knows.
Yeah.
So you use the metaphor of being on the stage, like it's almost like we practiced it before.
Yeah.
If you start taking front stage when you're not supposed to, everybody knows.
And how people respond in that moment, I think, I don't know that we can judge people based on one moment of like awkward responding, but I think we see over time when people are like, oh, you're out of line here. You're not in the right spot. Like, oh, like how people respond. Like some people are good improvisers and they just go with it and, away they go. And other people are like, I don't know what to do now. Like my place has been, I don't know where I'm supposed to be because you're not where you're, quotey supposed to be. So what does that mean for me? And like suddenly people get very, I think, in the stage metaphor, self-conscious in a way that is not smooth and flowing, and like things become very stilted in a way that is, not pleasing to watch, I would say, but also a sign of like deep work maybe being done or evidence that work needs to be done, both at the same time.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that way. I was thinking so much about how folks from non-dominant groups have to be so in tune with their own nervous systems and that of others. So it's a different way to look at what
or just so adept at code switching literally all the time. Like that is so expected by the dominant culture that if you're not in the dominant culture, you're going to code switch really fast to be in alignment with dominant culture expectations, ideals, the role, the caste. And that is work. That is labor. That is like, I think fundamentally an argument for affinity spaces in a lot of ways where people don't have to engage in that work in that same way and that type of labor. But also that's great. The bigger solution is like, hold on, let's question these expectations and assumptions and unspoken rules and all these ways that we trip people up between dominant and non-dominant cultures. Like how do we, I think I like this book and don't like it at the same time. Like, so what do we do? Is sort of this question that is like she doesn't lay out a 4-point plan. Like you're just like, here it is. And you're like, ugh. And now what? I'm just curious if you have any sort of like, I see you addressing this in the work that you do. And I guess maybe on the bigger scene. So now what? Now what do we do? We have like, I like understanding of caste in terms of how it operates. But what are your ideas about what we should do with that information?
I really love that we just naturally flipped into talking about dominant and non-dominant I do feel like that is helpful, just shifting the language. So we're really talking about, because it's slippery, who is white changes. Caste won't go away if we allow it to just keep being slippery like that. So I do think there's power in sharing that way of, and shifting the way we're thinking and talking about race and gender too. I don't know, Iggy, that's so hard. I think about you. Do you read Octavia Butler? Did you ever read any?
Yes.
Do you remember that which was it? The Exogenesis, I think, series.
I'm not sure. I haven't read that series. I've done Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents, and then a couple other smaller things. Yeah.
Well, in this series, it's 2 or 3. I don't remember. The human race has annihilated itself, and an alien race comes and rescues the survivors and takes them up to a ship. And it's very intense, because they are able to heal the human beings. They can go in and heal our cancers and all of this, and fine tune us. They also start, they're driven as a race to find and partner with other races to create the next species. And so they alter our ability, the human's ability to procreate. So my reproductive justice brain was like, what? Right now, you can't do that. But at the end, the human heroes really push, and we want this autonomy. We need this autonomy. We need to have our own human babies. And why? And it was in their encoding, in the Oankali is what they're called. They said, we can't. You are going to self-destruct. You're going to self-destruct. Because it has 2 fundamental flaws. And by the end of the book, that's like the teaser. By the end of the book, you find out that the 2 flaws are that humans are highly intelligent and they're hierarchical. And so that has left me with this low-key hopelessness for decades.
Oh no!
And I'm like, we're so driven to be hierarchical. That's and it's in our genes, is what I took from that. But now I'm like, maybe it's not. Maybe that's not in our genes. I don't think our ancestors were doing that, actually. I think they were doing something really different. So I think the more we can really, even in our nonprofits, maybe even especially, really think about how we're situated in capitalism.
Yeah.
And be more inventive about, like you're saying, little things, not even little, but disciplinary practices. So we can really be human-centered. I think there is hope there. And I do think we could relearn how to be in community.
Right.
Let go this fixation with hierarchy.
You would really like Dawn of Humanity, David Graeber, because he talks about how historically we were not hierarchical. We had very collective societies, and at times and places when we needed, he goes through so many different historical models in different places and all these sort of global study. He's like, there are times and places where you need a spokesperson or a leader, and a lot of societies had that. And that person would take on that role for a season or a month or a little bit of time, and then they're done, and then they can go back to hanging out, because hunter-gatherers had a lot of free time. The world was really bountiful. They weren't labor machines who had to farm and till and do all these things. That came later in terms of hierarchical structures, but also in terms of this building of the capitalist system in a lot of ways. So you might like that, because historically we didn't actually have the same type of hierarchy. And he also references a lot of this book called, Capitalist Realism, which is this little tiny tome by Mark Fisher, who talks about how we actually can't collectively currently imagine a system that's not capitalism. We struggle with this. We don't quite know what that would mean or how that would work, and our brains explode and whatever. The antidote to all of that is beloved economies, which is, hey, we actually can have a non-exploitive, non-capitalist driven, type of system within our organizations and within the work we do with humans. So there are other options out there. They're not as popular as capitalism, weirdly, because dominant culture seems to feed us what dominant culture really likes. Who knew?
Yeah.
perpetuating systems to support systems of dominance, essentially, which is, I guess, maybe I agree with like your low key depression, but also
it's hard.
The reality is there are other options, and they are out there. I mean, 100%. Finding them and doing the work to like bring them up is, I think, some of the work we can do, collectively as humans, individually as humans too.
Right. Yeah, I'm starting small.
Yep. Good luck, us. Good luck, humanity. I'm going to go find those Octavia Butler books. They sound great. They sound, she is so hardcore.
It was so challenging. It was challenging for me to get, I was really resistant. I was like, okay. Respect.
Yeah. I think the Parable of the Sower is tough, a tough read also.
Tough.
And
I know.
And so good.
I know a lot of folks read that during the Trump administration. And I was like, I did that during Bush.
Yeah.
I'm not reading those again, but right. Yeah.
But she literally in 1986, when she wrote them, or the 80s, I believe, had the slogan, Make America Great Again, was one of the slogans of one of her politicians who was not that awesome. Like a really kind of garbagey political movement. And I'm like, oh, this is also not new and weirdly echoing, coming back. And there was just definitely such a lot of wisdom contained within these sort of dystopic fiction, but also, I'm curious to read these other books too. A lot of insights around how we operate as people that she really just accentuates.
Mm-hmm.
Much like Isabel Wilkerson in Caste, like pulls out a lot of these themes and threads that we see to make it more obvious the water we're already swimming in, I think, in really cool ways.
That's right. And I think maybe it's good to say, if folks are inspired, if folks don't listen, she really does tell some stories, and some were really hard to hear. Really a lot of brutality. Not like the book is a lot of that. It's not, but
but she doesn't pull her punches around.
No,
the horrors.
She just really says it, and it's important that it's important the way that those stories are told.
I think the way they're told, and that they are told at all, to ignore them is really, again, like you're back to the metaphor of the old house, like, oh, everything's fine. It's fine. This never happened. Like there's still impacts and effects happening right now that, if you don't fix that crumbly foundation or that leaky roof, it's going to keep leaking. It's just going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So any last words of wisdom or positive upbeat moment where like everything's terrible, or any final thoughts on the book, I guess?
Final thoughts on the book. I really appreciated having listened to the On Being podcast before reading the book. Interestingly, it almost felt like a scaffold for the book.
Oh, that's great. Krista Tippett's very, I like her work a lot.
Interviewer.
Yeah.
She interviews such great authors and thinkers, and always consistently. So for what it's worth, I found that really helpful. And I've revisited it so many times. I have trouble with my eyes, and I think I read so much for work that I did Audible. And I've listened to it at least 4 times, probably.
Oh, that's great.
To pulling out different things and remembering certain moments. And it's also just a really kind of great history lesson. You mentioned that we're talking again about Nazi Germany and the relationship that and the way that Hitler saw the United States was pretty deep. So there's so much there. It's so rich. We've sort of just scratched the surface.
Oh yeah, for sure.
So yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Charley, for talking with me about this book today. I'm so glad we got together and made it happen. It's been really fun talking with you.
You too. It's good to chat with you, Iggy. Thank you for doing this podcast too. I really enjoyed listening to it.
Oh, thanks.
Great.
It's all for the fans. Just kidding. It's for my own entertainment. That's really why I do it. Thanks so much.
You bet. Take care.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Books Applied podcast. I hope you enjoyed getting to know a new book and learning how to apply its ideas to make your work, sport, or life a little bit more awesome. For more leadership education-related content, including conflict management checklists, invitations to a fun free lunch that happens monthly, upcoming classes, webinars, and mastermind groups, please head over to wslleadership.com. Thanks, and have a great day.